Not far from the glitz of Lake Placid, an old rusted sign points pilgrims to John Brown's grave. His body lies a moldering here in the Adirondacks in North Elba, New York, now a historic site, just 70 miles on a beautiful Adirondack Drive from Canton. Go sometime. And like I did with my family, and on a sunny day in July, you'll see people holding smartphones perpendicular to their ears, mourners touching stones, the casual and the curious peeking through windows of a preserved farmhouse. African Americans and white abolitionists have long viewed this site as sacred. In the 1920s, Blacks from Philadelphia made annual visits here and raised money to preserve this land and erect these monuments. One such monument honors the women who worked behind the scenes in abolitionism. The farm used to be surrounded by African American farming villages with names like Timbuktu and Negroes Hill. A rich white abolitionist gave land to Blacks to assure their voting rights. John Brown moved his family here to help with this experiment, though Mary Ann Day, his wife, and their young children endured the bitter winters, mostly without John Brown here. Now, Adirondack vacation homes dot the hillsides, but the clouds above in heaven are looking kindly down on the grave of old John Brown. Above the green leaves of tall trees protrudes out rather awkwardly a ski jump. My son wants to explore it. $20 per adult is not worth it, but we do it for the kids. Getting off the gondolas, it feels like you are in a bowl with high peaks jutting all around you. A plane takes off from the airport and you wonder if it will make it over the mountains. There's Whiteface. There's Mount Macy. A guide informs us. And there is John Brown's farm, he concludes. As we walk to the glass elevator to get to the very top of the ski jump, a woman asked, "Who was John Brown again?" My eyes lit up as if I was getting a chance to evangelize. "Well, you asked the right person. I can tell you more than you want to know," I replied. I had just gotten done reading a biography on John Brown. "He was an abolitionist, friends with Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, and he fought to keep Kansas a free state." That got a smile and an approving, upbeat "oh" from the inquiring woman. "I remember the song now. Glory, glory, hallelujah. But he is most famous," I kept going, "for his violent raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. He wanted to arm slaves for a guerrilla war and was later hanged for treason." This, there, right over there, is where John Brown's body lies. Now, her body language saddened, and she undoubtedly deplored the many manifestations of violence. With John Brown's memory in their minds, his song on their lips, and his soul in their hearts, hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers marched off to war. Just under a year and a half after Brown's body was laid in this high arable land. The soldiers tried to finish what John Brown had started. Some writers and historians say John Brown's raid was, in fact, the first battle of the Civil War. After all, Colonel Robert E. Lee was in charge of the Marines that captured and killed Brown's men. Jefferson Davis, who became president of the Confederacy, cited the raid as a reason to secede because armed insurrection led by escaped slaves was every Southern planter's worst nightmare. It reminded them of Nat Turner's slave rebellion and Haiti's revolution, where slaves came to power and massacred white plantation owners by the thousand. Brown's raid may have led to Abraham Lincoln being elected president. At the very least, John Brown accelerated the nation to war. Brown was many things, many things. A great planner, though he was not. Frederick Douglass told him face to face, very bluntly, that his plan was suicidal. The first casualty of the raid was an innocent black man, a train baggage handler. They were able to easily conquer the arsenal and fended off an armed militia, but they were no match for the Marines. But after the raid, the myth of John Brown only grew. Brown unwittingly used the new technology of his time to get his message out. His raid and trial was the first big news story the Telegraph would share with the entire country. Initially, he was portrayed as mad, as insane, but as he recovered from his wounds and spoke at his trial without notes, the nation found out that John Brown was a man of faith, an American who loved his country and wanted justice for all slaves. Sometimes called Captain, Brown likened himself to his grandfather, a captain in the Revolutionary War. In fact, Brown actually had his grandfather's gravestone moved to his farm in North Elba. Before the raid, Brown actually drew up something like a Declaration of Independence and a Constitution. He made his own state to sanction his own violence. During the raid, he took as hostage George Washington's great-grandnephew and made use of the first president's sword and pistol, which he attributed to having relic-like powers. Brown also thought of himself as a modern-day Samson. Remember Samson from the Hebrew scriptures? The long-haired last of the Israelite judges who had mighty strength, but as soon as he got his hair cut, he lost his strength. In the end, he grew his hair back and he tumbled down the support columns of a huge temple of his enemies, killing many of his enemies, including himself. But looking back now, to me, Brown is more of a Christ figure. He shed his blood for the original sin of our nation. He died rather publicly by the state, much like Christ. Though Brown was a bit of an old school, literal-minded, Bible-quoting Christian, many Unitarians agreed with him on abolitionism. Theodore Parker, who is my favorite Unitarian minister, and as I've said before, everyone should have a favorite Unitarian minister. Parker financially backed Brown, and so did Unitarian Samuel Gridley Howe, whose wife, Julia Ward Howe, wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic based on the song John Brown's Body. Though it is and was one of the most famous Unitarian hymns, it did not make it into our current hymnal. And in the process of trying to get rid of violence and violent language, we may have erased part of our abolitionist history. Another Unitarian minister, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, also aided John Brown's cause. So 3 of the so-called Secret 6 who funded John Brown's raid were Unitarians. a Unitarian minister from First Unitarian in Burlington, Vermont, presided over Brown's burial. Now, divine violence, putting those two words together may sound like an oxymoron. Divinity is something good. Violence is something bad. Seldom, if ever, is violence righteous, let alone divine. We all know violence is so final, like the last drone strike of the Afghanistan war. A Hellfire missile launched into a residential area because our government believed a white Toyota was full of explosives. As it turned out, they were really bottles of water. The person targeted worked for an American organization that promoted nutrition. He dreamed of moving to the US. 10 innocent civilians died, 7 of whom were children. They greeted their uncle in the small courtyard and played in his car, like our sons and daughters greet us and pretend to drive our cars. This strike was originally called righteous by military officials. The theater of war has been played like a video game. The person who pushed the button may have been in Virginia, for all we know, in a room of wall-to-wall flat-screen monitors. It was spineless, needless, ruthless, lawless, anything but righteous. Won't you shed a tear with me? The popular liberal ethic of violence is that it's wrong, except in self-defense. That war is almost always wrong, but certainly some are justified. World War II for sure, right? In our world, the state has control of violence. But what if the state is corrupt? John Brown believed in a higher law, which made him both a freedom fighter and a fanatic. A person willing to die for his beliefs that all people are born free. Now, I myself am not a violent man. I have never felt the steel or kick of a gun. I feel remorse for every mouse murdered in the snap of basement traps. I could not do what Brown did. Yet John Brown thought he was right and doing God's will, and history has justified his position. Unlike the January 6th insurrectionists, who also thought they were righteous, that they were freedom fighters and reenacting the Revolutionary War, but their violence was based on a lie. Brown showed us that beyond the state and beyond self-defense, there are justifiable uses of violence, which under the right conditions can become redemptive, buying a nation back from its own sin. So you see, John Brown's life goes beyond ethics, and Brown's blood shows us the limits of ethics, at least the kind that wants to universalize right and wrong for every situation. The ethics of violence has to have exceptions, and I think John Brown was that exception. Brown's moment was eaten with the ripeness of history, and justice unfolded. The overwhelming majority of people protesting in the last few years for Black lives have been nonviolent. Some have been violent. And I guess history will show us the divinity in violence. Out of the 5 black bodies of John Brown's raiders, none received a proper burial. In fact, 2 black bodies were quickly stolen and dissected by medical students and the remains discarded. What if John Brown's body was black? Would anyone have cared? Would thousands marched off to war? One black raider on his way to the gallows, John Anthony Copeland, said, "If I am dying for freedom, I could not die for a better cause. I had rather die than be a slave." He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so true. He frightened old Virginia till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor. They themselves, the traitor's crew. But his soul goes marching on.